Yeah, okay, so this is the final draft. It is a very intensive presentation on self-editing. This is kind of like my love letter to all of the authors that I've ever worked with, because I work with a couple of publishing imprints, and then additionally I am a freelance editor, so I work with indie authors and I work with traditionally published authors. And it doesn't really matter which side of the publication pipeline you're on or what your trajectory is, because I see a lot of the same things over and over again, kind of no matter what your goals are. So this is my love letter to all of those authors and to all of you on some things that, you know, hopefully will help you have a better, stronger draft when you're ready to start querying or when you're ready to start seriously considering self-publishing. And just as a heads up, before you get to this point, this final draft where you really start looking at like self-editing really, really hard, I would recommend that you have had some people read your manuscript, at least your first draft. So that would be like your alpha readers or critique partners, or even, you know, like if you feel like beta readers are appropriate, just I would hope that you've had some feedback from other people besides your own brain before you get to this point, because otherwise it might not be as helpful or effective. Okay. That being said, we'll finally get started. That's a lot of housekeeping. So through this first hour, we're going to be focusing on developmental editing. So that is mostly like your big picture things. This is your plot, characterization, pacing, tension, all of these things that like really, you know, make up a huge part of your novel and make up kind of why your novel is the way it is without focusing on line for line content. Okay, so we'll start at the beginning, your story structure and your plots. Throughout this presentation, it's going to be a lot of questions you might ask yourself, and I'll give a lot of examples of, you know, things to consider, but mostly this will be like a self-check for you guys. So with your story structure and plot, you know, you want to be making sure that you don't have too many major plot points. You just, for the most part, especially with genre, I'm assuming most of you are genre writers, science fiction and fantasy, right? Yes, no? Yeah? Okay, great. So for the most part, you just want to have like one major plot, maybe two major plots if you have, you know, two main characters whose narratives kind of equally, you know, matter. But those two plots should also like interweave quite a lot. So you want to make sure that in terms of like your main billing for your plot, you have it pretty well trimmed down. Is your major conflict too complex? Or like not specific enough. So when you're thinking about these things, you want to make sure that your plot goal and your character's goals can be expressed in tangible ways. You know, your character shouldn't want to be happy at the end of the book. Your character should want to have custody of their kids back, or your character should want to be the new king. Like very specific things, right? And then obviously they shouldn't be too easily attainable. You want to make sure there's adequate conflict and tension throughout. You know, if you have a character who's like, hey, I'm a pauper, but I actually do want to become king, and then, you know, kind of everybody in the book is kind of making way for your character to achieve this, that's probably too attainable for them. You probably need to add in more conflict, some more ways for your character to grow and experience some hardship as they're trying to accomplish that goal. Is your plot too familiar or cliched? Especially for genre, this is something you want to think about. There are certain cliches and tropes that are very acceptable within your genre. And that's kind of where knowing your convention is important, and knowing what is like very, very common in your genre is important. If you have a story that's kind of been done before a million times, maybe you want to evaluate some ways in which you can kind of twist that trope, or in which maybe you can like deconstruct that cliche a little bit to put a new spin on it. Do the stakes seem real? Again, like, can your character at any point in time walk away from the tension of this story? Like, can your character who wants to become a king someday, can he just decide halfway through, you know, this is kind of hard, I'm just going to go back to being poor? If that is, you know, if that's something that they can feasibly do, then perhaps you need to evaluate some ways in which your character kind of becomes locked in to that journey, either like physically, you know, maybe he's imprisoned, maybe it's like a life or death scenario, and it's not just about his dream to become king anymore. Maybe you know, maybe his life is on the line, maybe the lives of people he cares about are on the line. those kinds of things. Those will not only add tension, but it will kind of maintain your plot and pull it forward to the ends. So a note on subplots. If you have too many subplots, you will know this because about halfway through, your book will change drastically. And you will kind of lose track of what your character wanted at the very, very beginning. I see this a lot with newer writers, where they have a very strong start, and then they get to the middle, and they're kind of not sure how to kind of keep the tension going, and they obviously do want to make it difficult for their hero to achieve what he set out to do. But then they add so many subplots along the way that the story gets distracted, they're not followed up on, and the story kind of loses sense of itself. So you might want to evaluate it for that. If you have too few subplots, again, this might be indicative in your word count. For instance, if you are writing an epic fantasy, let's say an adult epic fantasy, and it's 50,000 words. Maybe you need some more subplots, guys. Maybe you need some more conflict and tension along the way, because that's a little short, that's a little to the point for what is often a 90 to 120,000 word kind of adventure. Back to conventions. Are you being consistent in the conventions of your story, or does your story start with one genre and end with another? I feel like this happens more often when I'm working on contemporary novels. I've had a lot of them where they start out contemporary and then halfway through they turn into a thriller, or vice versa. Again, you just kind of want to be thinking about your subplots, your main plots, how you're adding tension, how you're giving conflict to your character, and evaluating whether or not you're staying within your genre. And then too much exposition. This is a tricky one because obviously you want your readers to have the context that they need to understand your story, especially with fantasy or science fiction, because with fantasy there's so much invented content, there's invented cultures, invented magic systems, all of this stuff, and it's a lot for you to figure out as an author, first of all, and then because you spend so much time working on it, you want to make sure that your reader understands it and can appreciate all the hard work you did. And I get it. Similarly with science fiction, there's a lot of science involved, there's a lot of math involved, guys. But again, your reader, question in the back.
Starting with one genre and then with another, how do you work that with the idea of introducing romance or scary stuff? And do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really, really common for romance to become a subplot in the book, and to have it be a very early introduced subplot that kind of runs parallel to the main plot throughout the entire book and resolves about the same time that the main plot does. That is fine. That does not change your genre. What would change your genre is, again, back to the very cliched example of the pauper who wants to become a king. He meets a girl, and then the entire narrative becomes about the girl, about the relationship. Oh, I don't know about being king. I don't care so much about the political system. I don't care about overthrowing all of this injustice. I'm just going to be married to her at the end. That would be an example of switching genres and kind of straying away from your original story. And by the way, in early drafting, that might happen to you, and that might be a way for you to discover what your story truly is. And that is fine. But when we get to this point, when we're really trying to nail these things down and get them polished up for an agent or get them polished for self-publication, this is when you really have to commit to the kind of genre that you are working with. Back to the point of exposition, your reader is on a need-to-know basis constantly. So they only need however much context they need to understand to that point in the story. Certainly foreshadow is the best, but again, that's a 20/20 hindsight thing where they will understand it when they get the information that they need at the time that they need it. Okay, so this is something that I think every writer should do between every single draft of their book that they do. And this can be draft 0, between draft 0 to draft infinity. Write down a one-sentence summary of each scene in your book and ask yourself these questions. Does every scene or chapter bring my character closer to their goal? Have I left any plot holes? Did my characters grow emotionally? Did I wrap up all the subplots? Did I use cliches or cheap tricks to keep the plot moving? Do your characters have logical reasons for doing the things they did, or do they do things because plot? I see this a lot, and this is like, as an editor, you know, something that I personally focus on most often when I'm editing is making sure that the characterization supports the decisions that the character is making in the plot. And a lot of times, characters are doing things because the author needs them to do that very specific thing to move the plot forward, but there's no indication in their backstory or in their motivation or in who they are that would make them, that would bring them to that decision and that would have them make that decision. It feels out of character, right? So that's a big one I would suggest you all look for is are those turning points in your manuscript where your characters are making these decisions, is that informed by their character? If it's not, maybe you need to do a little bit more character work to get them to that point. Okay, we talked about the conventions of genre, and honestly, like a lot of these things that we're talking about are just going to be overlapping. It's kind of hard to parse it out individually, but again, back to conventions. You know, be thinking about what is a typical word count for your genre, and you're not totally locked in. Like you can have a shorter one, you can have a slightly longer word count for your genre, but you do kind of want to be thinking about like what everybody else who is writing and publishing in your genre is doing, so that you kind of can compare and like to kind of what you're producing. Yeah.
How do you know that? How do you find what word counts?
Google is amazing for writers. Honestly, yeah, just say like, what is the average word count for, what's your genre, for instance?
Science fiction.
Science fiction, yeah. What's the average word count for an adult science fiction novel or a YA science fiction novel? And there will be a lot of answers for that, and most of them will be like in the longish range. Most of you in here, if you're writing science fiction or fantasy, you're probably going to be, I would guess, in the realm between like 80,000 to maybe even up like to 120,000 words in terms of the word count of that is typical for your genre. Look at structure conventions and look at, so structure conventions, like what point of views are being used most often, to prologue or not to prologue, and how that fits into the age subgenre. For instance, I feel like adult fantasy is a lot more forgiving with prologues these days than YA fantasy is. Look at the strengths and weaknesses of your genre. So this is more toward romance, but for instance, like historically, romance novels do not always portray consent in the best way, right? So that might be a weakness of that genre. Historically, adult fantasy novels have a lot of, white saviors in them, or there's, what is that trope called where like you kill off the wife? Is it fridging her? I can't remember. Yeah, like where you introduce a very important female character at the beginning of your book, and then you immediately kill her off and use her death as motivation for your male character to like do their thing for the rest of their book. That might be a weakness. First of all, it's a cliche, but it also might be a weakness of that convention that you might want to evaluate or see how you can do your own twist on things. And then, yeah, tropes. Not all tropes are bad. Tropes make books very, very accessible to the reader because they know what kind of tropes they like. They know they like, the trope of a female character pretending to be a male character in order to like enter the army or something. I love that trope personally. So they're great, they're a great accessible starting point for your reader. What you want to be thinking of is, are you following that trope to plot point by plot point, or do you kind of have a setup and then do you kind of twist it or transcend that trope in order to make it a little more interesting for your reader? Yeah?
Do you have any good resources about word counts for specific genres, like where we can go and say, hey, if you're in sci-fi, fantasy should be in this, YA should be in this?
Really just Google. There's so many writing resources websites, there's so many editor websites, so many bloggers that so many authors who blog, that kind of thing. There's a lot of trustworthy information out there. Just do your Googling, guys. I know you're probably already Googling anyway, so, just add that to the list. Okay, so now we're actually gonna get to the meat. Let's look at the hook. So you want to hook your reader, the sooner the better. So as an acquiring editor, I read, hundreds of queries a month. And honestly, and my agents, the agents that I know will agree with me, the other acquiring editors I know will agree with me on this, we often know by the first page whether or not it's something we're going to request the full manuscript on. I mean, we will do our due diligence and we will read those first 3 chapters that you've submitted along with your query, we will check to make sure that we are not wrong. But more often than not, we are not wrong. So again, you really want to put your best foot forward. You don't have time to kind of like build up to your best content. You have the first page. So yeah, start in the middle of your tension. You don't necessarily need to be like in the middle of your scene, right? But like there should already be some established tension, some established characterization and conflict that is happening before, I'm losing my train of thought, before we start the story, so that it's already there built in those first pages. Did you have a question?
I did, and I'm sorry, but thank you. Hook your reader. I read, I won't say whose book it was on reading it, it was a discovery reader, author, organic kind of thing. Just don't worry about theme. You know your theme once you're done. But do you start out with the end in mind? Do you start out with books about the hook? Is it a giveaway? Is it a tease? What do you mean, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you should always have the end in mind. The beginning doesn't necessarily need to be like a circular reflection of that ending. Sometimes we do see that in novels, and sometimes it's really, really nice to have that circularity. Yours does not necessarily need to reflect that, but with your hook, and that's a great question, the things that we do want to see in the beginning that can be representative of theme and can kind of give an idea of where the book is going to go. We want to know who the character is. We want to know where they are. Depending on when your book is set, we want to know when the character is. We want to know what they want and why they don't already have it. And that initial what they want does not necessarily need to be the thing that they end up chasing after for the majority of the book. But they need to want something, and that something needs to lead them to that inciting incident. And then, why the reader should care about your character. Yeah, question?
Sorry,
No, you're fine.
Literary throat clearing?
So literary throat clearing is like, the sun rose and it came over the mountains so beautifully, and we're just going to set this really pastoral, beautiful scene. And then as that sun that was rising over those mountains all the way over there kind of like came up really, really high, it came in through the windows and landed on our point of view character on the next page. Does that make sense? Like it's not necessarily too much description, but just like
Things that don't matter and don't have tension.
Right. You can set the scene as you're telling the story, and it's actually more pertinent for the reader to get those details as they go along, because they're just not going to remember or care if they don't have a reason to. So that's an example of literary throat clearing. And then to the point of why the reader should care about the character's journey, a lot of that comes down to like they're already there because they like fantasy. They're already there because they like your trope. They're already there because, maybe the agent is already reading that first page because they liked your query, that kind of thing. So there's a certain amount of buy-in that happens already, so you don't super have to stress about making your character like the ridiculously most nice, agreeable person ever. That's actually pretty boring to read. So note there's a little bit of buy-in, but what people want to see is they want to see a sympathetic character. They want to see a character whose voice resonates with them, or whose experience resonates with them, or it's just really, really interesting. Like there have been, I work mostly in YA in middle grade, and there are a lot of characters in YA that like I would not want to be their friend, like ever, but they're interesting. Like their dysfunction is interesting. Their problematic worldviews are interesting, and so like I'll keep turning the pages as long as that continues to interest me. Is my timekeeper here? Hello? I don't think she's here. Do you guys know what time it is? 9:22. Okay, I think we're doing good. All right, so point of view. So when selecting a point of view, consider what serves your story and your writing style best. Most often for genre, we see, a third-person limited or a first-person point of view. Both are totally legitimate. In YA, we more often see the first-person point of view. That's fine. You kind of want to think about whatever fits your writing style. So if you kind of have like a natural, more narrative distance type writing style where it feels awkward to you to be writing I feel this way or I whatever, maybe your point of view should be like a third person limited. Or if you like are just really good at like emotionally connecting with that character and like getting into their voice and into their head, super, super closely, maybe first person is where it's at for you. So avoid, yeah.
Some of these questions seem like they need to be addressed at the beginning of your writing.
Mm-hmm.
How much of what you're talking about today needs to be deferred until everything's down on paper to prevent that thing just constantly rewriting that first page and feeling like you never launch?
Right.
Like, so are these kind of like post-writing things when you're editing? Point of view, I guess you would decide at the beginning. When?
So I think these are questions you should be asking yourself throughout. And as you're receiving feedback from people, you should still be asking yourself these questions. Because often when I receive these manuscripts, they've finished their book and they've already like been thinking about all of these things. But maybe they, you know, in the scope of some final edits they've made, they should have considered their point of view again. Maybe they should have considered the conventions of their genre and really, really common tropes, these kinds of things. This is meant to be pretty comprehensive, and I don't know, there are a lot of writers who kind of think that, you know, with a certain genre, for instance, if they're going to write a YA fantasy, that it needs to have like X, Y, Z, because that's what everybody else's has. That's not necessarily true, and so I'm not sure if I'm even answering your question, but these are questions you should be asking yourself throughout, and these are definitely questions you should be self-checking before you submit it for publication, whether that's self-publishing or querying. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so I actually see a ton of head hopping, like even in later drafts where we are infiltrating some characters who are not point of view characters. So you want to avoid that head hopping. I think in adult fantasy, we're a little bit more forgiving about that like godly point of view. But typically in YA, and a lot of like these more fast-paced, like character-driven narratives, we don't like to be hopping around a whole lot. Yeah, point of view should be filtered through one character at a time. Yeah.
What's the difference between omniscient and head hopping? I've never been able to get a good definition on that.
Head hopping, so omniscient is when you're doing it on purpose.
Sorry, could
Yeah.
you say the question?
So the question was, what's the difference between an omniscient point of view and head hopping? So my take on it is omniscient point of view is when you're doing it on purpose. Head hopping is when you accidentally slip into somebody else's perspective who is not your point of view character, and share information with the reader that they should not have at that time because they are not connected to that point of view character. Does that make sense? And whereas with omniscient, you're doing it on purpose and you're doing it consistently throughout the manuscript. So head hopping is more of like a slip. Omniscient is more of a consistent choice that you see throughout the book. Yeah, of course. So yeah, typically we like to see point of view maintained one scene, one section, one chapter at a time. I actually really, really love books that have more than one point of view character, but we need to be connected, like it needs to structurally be set up in a way that's accessible for the reader so they're not constantly asking themselves, oh, well, whose head am I in now? What happened? Oh, you know, keep it to one scene at or one section at a time, one chapter at a time. If you do switch point of view, you want to have like a very firm section break, something to visually cue to the reader that things are changing. And if you have multiple point of view characters, I think it's a totally legitimate choice, by the way, especially in some of these genres that you're working in, because they can bring in like different tone and subtext and motivation to your book. But you do want to be asking yourself if there's redundant content. There's been several authors that I've worked with who are very far along in their stages. They had some point of view characters who were fairly redundant, they were already accomplishing the things that that point of view character brought to the table really, really well in some of their other point of view characters. And so that's an opportunity to trim that point of view out and to have the book be a little more tight as a result. Did you have a question? In the blue shirt? No? Okay, I thought I saw. Okay, no worries. Okay, so we've, yeah.
I have a question. Does dialogue change the point of view?
Does dialogue change the point of view? I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, you know, if boy and girl are talking and it's going back and forth, and the boy says this, and then you tell what he's thinking, and the girl is responding to what he says. And does that, I mean, you said one point of view per scene. But in dialogue, does that not naturally happen?
Dialogue is not an instance in which your point of view changes. So dialogue is like you and I having a conversation right now on the surface, and then I think, this is a really, really great question. I'm really glad that we can talk about this. We're still getting this filtered through my point of view, even though you're saying the words physically. Does that make sense? Okay.
A lot. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like your hat, by the way. Okay, so we've talked a lot about cliches. Again, like I see them all the time, guys. And I really want you guys to be thinking about these things very, very carefully, especially a lot of these common cliches that really cross genre. You just see them everywhere. Character looking in the mirror to describe their appearance. That's like every YA book I read. You know, meet cute. We see that more often in romance, but I've seen it in fantasy. I've seen it in science fiction. The traditional clumsy female protagonist who's like can't make it up a flight of stairs, but is also a genius somehow. I don't know. You know, just complex female characters are great, guys. That's all I'll say about that at this time. I might rant later. I see characters being emotional runners really, really often, and this is going to come into characterization, which I think we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, so like decisions that are not coded into the character or into their backstory. You know, like, so we have a character who he's really struggling with something really hard, and he puts on some running shoes and then runs 7 miles. But also, like, that's not part of his character at any point before that in the manuscript. We don't hear about him being athletic. We don't hear about him training. We don't hear about any of these things. I mean, I'm not a runner. I am not that great at exercising, quite frankly. And if I decided that emotionally my way for me to work through something that's hard for me was to run 7 miles, I would probably just die. So, you know, let's have some realism with some of these things. And then starting and ending a chapter with the character waking up or going to sleep. This is a really natural thing for all of us because like all of our daily episodes of life start with waking up and with going to sleep, or end with going to sleep. But we don't need that in narrative. We can kind of like subvert that very, very common thing. Okay. So placing the smoking gun on the mantle. Does everybody know what this reference is? Yep, so this is a Chekhov reference. And I use it to talk about foreshadowing. I use it to talk about plot holes. I use it to talk about like, you know, kind of like whatever your MacGuffin thing might be. You know, if there is something that your character needs to have in a later scene that it's not negotiable, you need to kind of leave breadcrumbs for that. If you foreshadow something, you know, like your character getting magical powers at some point, maybe that needs to happen later on, or that needs to be addressed later on. And as you're looking at the plot worksheet that you have already made at this point, these are questions you want to be asking yourself to make sure you're not leaving things unaddressed, leaving plot holes open, or like, and it can be like honestly really, really simple things. Like if you kind of have like a smutty scene, but like one of your characters doesn't take their clothes off, like that sounds difficult. Yeah, and then if you can't keep the promises that you've made, let's say in an earlier draft, you're like, it would be really cool if this supporting character had this arc, and then later on you decide it's not that important, that's fine, just take it out. And then again, real life does not need to make sense, yeah, it's sad. Real life does not need to make sense, guys. I'm still working through that trauma myself, but fiction does. Okay, this is a really easy thing, but again, I see it a lot. Check your character names. Do a control find if you find a typo. I have seen so many character names just change slightly halfway through. And if possible, for the clarity of the reader, you want to be avoiding character names that are spelled similarly or phonetically sound very similarly. It can be very confusing to the reader. Okay, so speaking of characterization. All right, so I've mentioned before, like I'm big on characterization. You know, when I'm working with an author, every single aspect of that story needs to be grounded in the character and in their backstory. And like I often refer to it as their baggage, right? We all have baggage, and that baggage, more often than not, is the reason why we do a lot of the things that we do. Same thing with your characters. And unfortunately, our main characters, our protagonists, are often the last characters in the book to emerge as like interesting or complex. Yes?
I know you said that using characters that have similar names, but if you can like group them? Like, this is the comedy group, and there's like 3 of them. Can you make these sound the same?
That sounds actually like really, really cute. So like, are they often in existing in the book as like a group, as like a matched set?
Yeah, or like you have 3 characters in the book that are naturally comedic, and it's like Carl, Kate, and I don't know, but just make them all sound the same.
Mhm.
How like people think it in their head.
So on the one hand, that's like a really, really fun author choice that you as an author like are absolutely entitled to make. And I kind of like how it's like, it's like a matched set of characters. Also, it's entirely possible that your reader, like that those 3 characters whose names sound the same, and especially if they're grouped together in the manuscript, they might all blur together for your reader. So there's pros and cons to that, certainly. Sorry, I just hit the microphone. Okay, so yeah, so you're often the point of view character is the one who ends up being the least complex, least interesting. We try so hard to make them everything that we think they need to be that they end up just kind of flat. So you do want to be checking your main character for, check their baggage, check what's going on with them, and like what has happened to them in their past that makes them act a certain way, and whether that like is a trauma or whether that is an absence of trauma, and they're just like really, really well adjusted, and the people around them are not, and that can be a source of tension as well. They need to have likes, they need to have dislikes, they need to have a favorite food, they need to have, hobbies, goals, they need to have specific goals, they need to want to be something when they grow up, and not necessarily all of these things need to find their way into your manuscripts, but you need to know these things about your character so that, we're not halfway through the book that you're submitting to an editor or an agent and they're like, oh, well, I don't really know like what this character likes or who they are or why they want to become king. Like I'm not understanding their motivation. So some quick ways to get into your character's headspace and just double check on this development. Give them a Myers-Briggs test. Do we have any people in here who play D&D? Excellent. So I actually love, both with work that I'm editing and work that I'm writing myself, I love checking out the characters' alignments, and that helps a lot with understanding like why they're making the decisions that they're making. I'll be checking, oh my goodness, like does it make sense for this character to be like so just incredibly like to the rules at every point? It's kind of ugh. And then I'm like, oh, he's a lawful good character. Yeah, that makes sense. These are just really quick, easy ways to kind of like make sure that your character is not doing things because plot, and that they're actually doing things because of who they are and what they believe in and what they want. Check their moral compass. Again, like we want morally complex characters who like, all of us on a good day, it's easy to do good things, it's easy to do the right things, it's easy to be kind. On a bad day, maybe we're not that great, maybe we're a little selfish. Your characters should be as well. Check their archetype. That's another great way to kind of be checking in with things, especially with fantasy and some of these like more like heavier genre books. There are certain archetypes that like play together in certain ways that we're very used to seeing. So ask yourself, like, do you have a prankster archetype character, and how are they moving throughout your book, for instance? Is that a typical way for that archetype to move? If it's not, then does that help your book? Does that hurt your book? These kinds of things. We've talked about this before. If your point of view character can walk away from the conflict at any point, your book is in serious trouble. Be thinking about chemistry between your main characters, and then also don't forget your supporting characters. They are not bench warmers, guys. They need to also have things that they want, things that they like. They need to have personalities. They need to have flaws. And one of my very most favorite things to see is when a supporting character wants something that is in direct conflict with your main character, and then they have to come to terms with that one way or another. Okay, dialogue. Awesome. So do you have too much dialogue, or do you deliver too much information through your dialogue? So this is checking back to like your reader being on a need-to-know basis at all times. And then, this is also hearkening to like, does your dialogue sound natural? So if any of you are having a hard time making sure your dialogue is natural, and that's like a big weakness for you, even as you're continuing to refine your manuscript, I'm going to suggest that you just go hang out at the coffee shop after this and like pretend to put in your earbuds, but don't actually listen to anything, and just like be a creeper listening to everybody's conversation. You know, it's a great way to kind of hear how people speak to each other, hear what they say to each other, hear what they don't say. I think dialogue is just as interesting. I think what is not being said in a dialogue scene is just as interesting as what is being said. You know, you want to be thinking about those things. Your character should have distinct voices, and those distinct voices should be informed by their backstory, by how educated they are, by where they come from. Their voice can even be informed by like how comfortable they feel sharing things with the other person in the scene. You know, we all have filters, and depending on how emotionally intimate we are with the person that we're speaking to, we're going to have that filter up or we're going to have that filter down, and the same thing is true for your characters. So dialogue tags. Said is great. Said is just like awesome. Yeah, question?
Just a quick question, talking about dialogue and your voice regarding accents.
Okay.
So if you have a story where you can't just say, oh, they have a British accent, and it makes sense, what are some of the ways that you can really bring that out? Is it through contextual clues, or is it better to kind of spell out the pronunciation of some
Right.
things?
Did you guys all hear that question? Okay, so for his example was, let's say you have a character with a British accent, but you don't want to be necessarily like spelling out their accent in a way that is distracting for the reader. What are some ways that you can help flesh out and show that they do have an accent without, you know, without like distracting your reader? So I think especially in the case of like British accents, it's pretty easy to just look at word choice. You know, they're going to say lift instead of elevator. They're going to say bins instead of garbage cans. Things like that are pretty accessible for the reader. Yeah, I read all the Harry Potters, and I didn't realize that trainers were sneakers until like, I don't know, 2 years ago. You know, things like that. Like, that's an example of, you know, of informing the accent, informing the way they speak without actually like writing out like, hello, darling, and like having all the A's and H's. Does that make sense? Yeah, so to that point of dialect, that's a great way, like if you have a dialect or if you have a vernacular, that's a great way to kind of flesh that out in the character's dialogue without being distracting to the reader. Yeah?
I love the word bloke.
The word what?
Bloke.
Bloke.
Nobody says bloke, they're correct.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, use bloke. And yeah, so tags. Let's talk dialogue tags a little bit more. So said is great. I would even say you can sprinkle in some adverbs if you really need them, guys. So like said excitedly, but in general, I would recommend you stay away from them because your dialogue should already tell us that they're excited, that they're angry, that they're hangry, whatever else. And then, I don't know, profanity, meh. I think you just want to be thinking about like your genre and the conventions of your genre, and perhaps like if you're writing middle grade or younger YA, and there's not going to be as much profanity in it, you do want to be considering your reader. And then character voices, like along with everything else that we talk about, you want to be aiming for consistency. So if you have a character who's perhaps a little rough around the edges, perhaps is, you know, more of just like of the people, folksy kind of character, and then halfway through they develop a very distinguished, educated voice, you know, that's no good. And that is a higher level thing that I do see a lot. I see a lot of inconsistency in character voices, and that's something you're going to want to be checking. Okay, tension. So we've talked a lot about tension. Tension is the best. It is like the reason that we keep turning the pages. So your character should have opposing goals, and there should be a cost for your character to get what they want. It shouldn't be easy for them. It should take things from them. It should be just the hardest decision they've ever had to make to get the thing that they want. Additionally, your tension should ebb and flow. Okay, so example of this. So Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, that scene in the Mines of Moria where they're like running from the Balrog, incredibly high tension scene, like scary AF. You know, they're running, there's like a big old fire monster, and there's like orcs like coming out of everywhere, and we don't know if they're gonna make it, and then it looks like they are, and then, you know, Gandalf takes that fall, and like all the ugly crying, just, oh, that, even like, I'm like choking up a little bit thinking about it. That is an example of a high tension scene, and like, you know, and we certainly want those coded throughout your manuscript, and to the point of Fellowship of the Ring, like that was a high tension scene that happened like kind of middle-ish, right? Like it wasn't the climax of that part of the story. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like your climax that is incredibly tense. You can have it coded throughout, and you should have it coded throughout. But then you also need to have breathing room. So after they had that horrible trauma in the Mines of Moria, they went to Lothlorien and they like chilled a little bit and they like maybe worked through some stuff, right? You want to be kind of adding moments for your character and your reader to breathe, especially when crazy traumatic things are happening. If you just have tension constantly, like having tension always in your book means you have tension never in your book, right? You need that variation, because otherwise your reader's going to be either like just super bummed out, which you don't want, or they're just going to be totally desensitized to kind of the emotional tension that you're trying to encode in your manuscript. Let's see. I see a lot of authors, this is more beginning authors that submit, but they try to protect their characters. They protect them from embarrassment, they protect them from physical pain. Like they'll build these stakes, right? They'll build the stakes that like it's a life or death thing, and then their character will like always emerge totally unscathed and like totally like just doing fine. You're protecting your character. You know, maybe if you're going to make the stakes that high, consider what it might cost, consider following through with that cost. I always think it's really interesting what authors choose to protect their characters from, and I think it points back to us and some of our own hang-ups about like what we try to protect ourselves from. I don't know, it's interesting. That could be a whole other separate discussion. But yeah, like be asking yourself like if the consequences and the costs in your book are matching the stakes that you're layering. You have a question?
Yeah, just another quick one. Do you have any advice on like what's a good ratio? Because you can go anywhere from, like you were saying, where they never have any cost whatsoever, to just use an example like Game of Thrones, where you're killing off characters left and right.
Right.
What's a good ratio of protecting your main characters?
I think the consequences should always be in direct relation to whatever the stake is, and the stakes should rise throughout the course of the book, like especially with genre work, right, where, you know, it starts off at this point, tension rises up to this point, there's like some kind of like really, really tense scene, we get breathing room. We go back up a little higher, we get breathing room. We go back up even higher, and that's kind of the pattern that you might follow. And with every peak, the stakes should be a little bit higher, and the cost to kind of come out on the other side of that and survive it should also be a little bit higher. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, great. And then your tension should be layered through multiple sources. So like, what's an example of this? So let's look at Frodo. He's like trying to take the ring to Mordor. That is like physically getting his body and the ring to Mordor is like an external source of tension, because that is hella hard. Also internally, he's like grieving, he's thinking he's not good enough, his soul is being like slowly destroyed. These are all internal things that like we're not necessarily seeing on the outside, but they are certainly adding tension to his character and to his journey. And then this is not necessarily like, this is something you'll want to check for yourself. It might not necessarily like be the best fit for you, but if it's possible for your story to unfold in a shorter time frame, maybe see if that is something you can feasibly do. Like I am still just in awe of the series 24. I don't know if any of you guys ever saw it. I was like 13 when it came out. But just the fact that like they had an entire series that focused on like one day. I'm like, whoa, that's crazy. So the pacing is the speed and the rhythm of your novel. It carries your novel to its conclusion, and just like tension and just like everything else that we've talked about, there should be some variance in it. You want to have an ebb and flow in your novel. So you want to have these faster moments and these quieter moments. Typically, you can tell if your pacing is too slow because there will be big blocks of text just again and again and again without end. For pages and pages. That's going to be slower pacing. That's going to be more internal dialogue, more exposition, more setting, just more for the reader to absorb and get through. Fast pacing is typically like snappy action scenes or dialogue heavy scenes, and you can kind of glance at those and identify them pretty easily, because rather than big blocks of text, it's just line, 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 line. Very fast for the reader to read, very fast for them to absorb. So if your pacing is too slow, if this is some feedback you've gotten that like people are engaged at first and then they kind of lose track of it, or they slow down, or whatever else. You might want to look for some shorter sentences. You might want to lean heavier on scene and like the physical choreography of what is happening. You might want to take a step back from how deeply emotionally connected you are to your character in that moment and focus on some more surface things. Let's see. I just lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. This is a long time to talk. Yeah, and then, again, like you want to be making sure that you're adding tension and foreshadowing to kind of break up some of those like slower paced moments. And then if your pacing is too fast, and quite frankly, I more often see books that come in where the pacing is too fast than that it's too slow. Again, this is evident by like lots of dialogue just back and forth forever. And the reader's not really being allowed to like settle in the moment, absorb the moment, and really like understand what it means for the character, that like what is being said or what is happening in that moment. So yeah, you slow it down. You add more words. You have bigger paragraphs. You take in the senses. I think especially where it relates to emotion and like big emotional moments that are being revealed through dialogue. Just slowing down and being like, my character's stomach is like, their stomach is gonna twist, their hands are gonna get sweaty, and if they get some information that just is like mind-blowing to them, like so-and-so's world was just shattered, like things like this, where you just kind of like wallow in it for a second, and you allow your character to wallow for a second so that the reader can fully appreciate what is happening. And as always, like engaging emotionally with your character is so important, and it's so important that you do that through concrete details, physical sensations. What does it feel like? What do they see? What do they hear? Yeah, question.
I'm writing this short fiction with time, but the whole book is almost set in the same city 100 years later or 100 years later. So is there a certain way I can make the characters have more adventures or something in the same place?
Come talk to me after, and we'll workshop that for a second. I might need to ponder on that for a minute, but yeah, come talk to me after. Yes, and then flashbacks. A note on flashbacks. They're certainly very, very effective for storytelling, but they do slow down your pacing, and they will slow down your momentum, because your reader has to go, your reader and your characters, and whatever you're showing at that time has to be pulled back away from the present story to kind of like take in this flashback. And then they have to get back to where they were, and then they have to build that momentum back up. So you can see how that might pull your reader out of the story, how that might slow your pacing down quite a lot. It's definitely still a legitimate decision if you want to make it, but you just be aware that you will kind of have to try to make up that pacing afterward, and that tension and all those things that you lose by going into that flashback. You'll have to make it up. Okay, setting. So I think this is hilarious. You're the only person that has ever laughed at this slide, so thank you so much. So on the right, we have we'll use this as a metaphor for setting. On the right, we have the real thing. It's fleshed out, it's authentic, it's informed by the world in which it was created. On the left, we have like a cheap imitation of setting. It's, we know what you're aiming for, but you're just falling short. So yeah, with setting, and this is like an incredibly crucial thing for science fiction and fantasy, right? And your world needs to be immersive. It needs to engage your reader and your character's 5 senses. Something that I love to see, whether it's like a story set in modern day Provo, for instance, or an invented world, is that where the character currently is in the story, whatever that setting is, that needs to be informed by the history of that place. So Provo today, it's a very, very interesting town. It's what we're seeing now when we walk outside of this hotel is informed by decisions that have been made over time and by the culture, and that is also informed over time. All of these things have been building and have been layered to bring us to this moment, right? Similarly, even if you have an invented world, especially if you have an invented world, you want to make sure that wherever your character is, whether it's an ancient time, whether it's in the future, whatever it is, it needs to be informed by the history of that place. And then similarly, be spending a lot of time, and lean on your beta readers, lean on like your friends who are reading your manuscript for you to kind of poke holes in your world building. Your magic system, if you have one, it needs to make sense. It needs to be used consistently. There needs to be some pretty clear rules about how it works so that your reader understands it. If you, let's say you have a culture, a city that is set on some different planet, what is the gravity of that planet? What is the atmosphere like? How do those changes in gravity and atmosphere affect the people who live on it? How have they evolved differently over time? What is the structural whatever of the buildings in a planet with that kind of gravity? Like, these are the questions you need to be asking yourself, and you really need to like do the hard work on so that it's just really, really fleshed out and you have the Darth Vader and not whoever that guy is. And that, like, honestly, setting could and is, I'm sure, its own hour-long presentation, but those are just some things you want to be thinking of. Okay, so we're done with developmental editing. We're done with the big picture. You've looked at your big picture, you've talked to beta readers, you've had them read your stuff, you've like evaluated, you've looked at the conventions of your genre, you've looked at best practices, you've perhaps changed the way you're doing some things in your book. These global changes have been made. Fantastic. Now we start with kind of the line level changes. So like every paragraph, every line, every sentence, every individual word choice. And it's important that you know that you shouldn't spend too much time on line editing and word choice before you kind of finalize your developmental editing, because it might be a waste of time, because the prose that you agonize over for hours might end up getting cut. So, just in your own best interest, maybe save this part for a little bit later. Okay, so line editing. I'm sure we've all heard showing versus telling. Like, it's the thing that like every creative writing 101 class / blog post / conference session, including this one, we all talk about it. And a point that needs to be made about showing versus telling is that not all telling is bad, and not every single thing needs to be shown, okay? Things that are really, really important to the manuscript, to the plot, to the characters' choices, those need to be shown. I was editing a book last week in which like the entire kind of crux of the plot and the manuscript was that this girl fell in love with this boy after she had already rejected him. And so it was that unrequited love for the entire rest of the manuscript. Unfortunately, this author chose to use 2 paragraphs of the entire 90,000 word book to talk about this character falling in love. That is an example of inappropriate telling. We need to see those things so that we can so that we have buy-in, so that we understand it. On the flip side of things, I've seen a lot of books where it just painstakingly talks about the character's morning routine when they get up. So first of all, that is a cliche to start a chapter with when the character wakes up. Second of all, we don't need to know like how they like their eggs in the morning after they shower, and all these, those things can be told, they can be summarized. Maybe they don't even need to be there at all. So that caveat aside, when it comes to showing versus telling, an important thing is that you use strong verbs, the stronger the better, and then that you use specific significant details. So to the point of the book that I edited last week, it was a little rough, guys. There was a section in the book at which the protagonist was talking with another character, and she had been having some health problems, and the other character said, well, what were the results of your lab tests? And this character said, every single test came back low, and that was the answer to his question. That is not a significant detail. That is like a red flag, right? Because depending on like what those levels were, like this character could now have like 7 different chronic illnesses. So, maybe like my thyroid came back low, or like whatever else. Like that is an example of a specific detail that the reader can be like, oh, I know what that is, or oh, I have context for that. I understand what that is. I understand what that looks like. This helps me understand everything better. So showing versus telling, don't tell readers how to feel. don't tell them what to think, and don't be their moral compass. So my favorite books are ones with complex characters who make hard choices that are not black and white. And, I see the consequences of those choices for good or for evil, and I see them grappling with those things throughout the manuscript. And then after the novel is over and whatever tension is resolved, it's then on me to kind of decide how I feel about it and how I feel about those characters' choices. Okay, has anybody watched this Netflix show? I don't tend to update my slides very often, but this is one I had to make an exception for. So when it comes to trimming, and we're going to talk about trimming a lot in the next few slides, whether it is a paragraph, whether it is a character, whether it is a specific word choice, ask yourself, does it spark joy? Does it make you happy? Do you feel like it has a home in your manuscript? If it doesn't, that's totally fine. Thank it for being part of your creative journey, and just cut it out. Okay, so dialogue tags. We've already mentioned this. Again, there's some overlapping information here. Sad is cool. Sad is great, guys. I think there's certainly room for some of these very specific dialogue tags, but maybe they would be better used as specific verbs in a sentence rather than a specific dialogue tag. Again, said will take you a mile. These will take you, I don't know, not a mile. I'm not good at distance, guys. Okay, so some other things to be looking out for. Avoid adverbs, adjectives, and hedging. So adverbs, anything that kind of ends in ly, like excitedly, hungrily, sleepily, whatever else. Stephen King claims the road to hell is paved with adverbs. I tend to agree with that. Typically, to me, an adverb is a sign that you are not using specific details to show what is happening. They're kind of like a crutch word, right? So if you're using an adverb with a dialogue tag, for instance, you're using like, she said, hungrily. I keep going back to hanger, guys. I think that's a sign. Maybe that's a sign, maybe using that adverb is a sign that you need to kind of look for some other opportunities in the actual dialogue to convey that message. So I love this quote from Solstein. He says that 1 + 1 = 1/2. Which means the power of your words is diminished by not just picking the better one. And, I feel like this is like just good advice in life. Like, have you guys ever had like a pluot before? It's like a plum and an apricot. 1 + 1 = 1/2, guys. Just stick with one. So yeah, if you're using a lot of adjectives, like kind of look at your sentence and be like, well, maybe they don't need to be cold, clammy, and shiveringly in one sentence. That's a bad sentence. Trim it out. And then avoid hedging verbs. So hedging is where you're kind of like, you're setting up something and then you're almost like undermining yourself a little bit. So almost laughed. They can just laugh, that's fine. Or frowned slightly, right? They undermine your sentence, they undermine what you're trying to do. They're just kind of dumb. Just don't do it. All right. So we've talked about this a little bit with telling versus showing. So eliminate excess, avoid overly specific stage direction. So like rather than saying, Carl stood up from the table, pushed his chair back, stepped around it, pushed it back in, walked across the kitchen, opened a cupboard, grabbed a cup, poured, that whole thing. You could just say, Carl got up and grabbed a cup of coffee. So much easier. You do want to be paying attention to your choreography, like if you're writing a fight scene, that's a moment when you can be a little bit more specific, and perhaps you don't want to just kind of leave the reader to like figure it out for themselves. Similarly with, like smutty scenes, that kind of thing. But in the general choreography of your scenes, you can kind of leave a lot up to the reader. So your crutch words. Does everybody in here know what a crutch word is? Does anybody not know what a crutch word is? So a crutch word is like, and this is something you might want to lean on your beta readers for, or people who are reading your manuscript, because it might be difficult for you to identify, but there are words that you use a lot. Often smiled. I see smiled all the time. Everybody is smiling all the time, always, in every book. That could be a crutch word. And maybe, you know, you could do a control find on your manuscript and you can see all the 70,000 instances in which your characters are smiling at each other. Tone it down, guys. You can tone it down. That is an example of a crutch word. And as you're reviewing your manuscript, just kind of be like, I think you'll probably notice if some of these words pop up again and again and again. Just like, don't take the phrasing for granted and really like evaluate it. Yeah.
So one thing that I've noticed, kind of like said, a hard time finding something that is the same as nodding.
There's a lot of nodding too, yeah.
Because, you know, you're going through, you know, I tried to look up synonyms for nodding, and most of them are just not as simple and straightforward as nodding. Right. Is that, you know, is that too much? Is that...
It depends on how often you're using it. I'm going to answer that in a couple different ways. First of all, you don't need to have choreography accompanying every line of dialogue. That's something that I personally fall into a lot with my own writing. And second of all, you know, if you take them out a few times here and there, but what the character is saying is some kind of affirmation, then that's enough. I mean, the reader can, like, the point is getting across that's even if we're not physically seeing your character nod, he is affirming whatever else is happening in the scene. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great. So omit redundancies. Free gift. She nodded in agreement. Just if you use nodded, just nodded. Shrugged his shoulders. Are there any other body parts that you can shrug? I'm not sure. Blinked her eyes. I see a lot of like, he handed it with his hand, with his palm. Just, you know, we can make those assumptions that people are going to use hands to hand each other things. I don't know. So in terms of like trimming and like looking at like the economy of the words that you're using, pretend you have to pay 15 cents for every single word in your manuscript. And then do some math on your calculator, on your phone that we all have. That number might astound you. Yeah. So if it's a gift, it's free. Like, gifts are free. So giving somebody a free, it's redundant to say free gift because gifts are free. Yeah. That's a good question though, because it seems like some other people didn't get that. So thank you for asking. But yeah, so like, you know, let's say you do that exercise where, and you see how much your manuscript would cost if it was 15 cents per word. You know, maybe you want to bring that number down a little bit. Maybe then you're like, oh, I can trim. Okay, so I'm sure all of you have heard active voice. Let's use it. So some general things about active voice. If you have a lot of was and were words, like she was angry, they were eating, that's probably an example of active voice. So, or a passive voice, I'm sorry. That's an example of passive voice. So here's an example of active voice. Kelsy kicked the ball, scored a goal, and shouted in victory. This is fiction because I do not play soccer. Passive voice, the ball was kicked, the goal was scored. I've been talking too much. And victory was shouted by Kelsy. So it's clunky, but you can see the difference there. And then a caveat about using passive voice. Every now and then, it can be like the chili powder in the spice rack of your like writing spice rack. That's a terrible metaphor, guys. I'm sorry. But you get what I mean. You can use it sparingly. So for instance, like if you wanted to phrase a sentence in a way that there was a lot of build up of what was happening and the final word was important to you for whatever reason. And this is like a legitimate choice in terms of like your lines and like the rhythm of your prose. So for instance, if it was really important to you as a writer that all of that choreography, the ball was kicked, the goal was scored, and that was kind of like, I can't even say it, the goal was scored. Ooh! If it was really important that all of that was kind of a build-up to ending on Kelsy as the end of that sentence, then that is a choice that you can make throughout your manuscript, but sparingly. If we see that a lot, then it's kind of a passive, boring construction. But again, every now and then you can use it if you use it well. Okay, get rid of sticky sentences. This is still trimming. The sticky sentences are full of glue words, and they are the 200 or so most common in the English language. they're the empty spaces in your writing, like is, as, the, that. You can remove a lot of that, so I can tell you that. I can tell you that right now. You know, and these are pretty easy to find, like a control find on your manuscript, and they'll pop up, and you can kind of go through and be like, oh, you're right, I didn't need that many that's. So here's an original really terrible sentence. Kelsy needed to take the cat to the vet, and so she asked for the contact number of the office who was in charge of scheduling at the vet. So obviously there are some things in here that are not necessarily glue words, but you can see how the construction is overly specific and is full of those glue words. The edit, Kelsy called the vet's office to schedule an appointment. This is not fiction. I have 5 cats. They are very expensive. Okay. All right, I love this quote by Mark Twain. Don't use a $5 word when a 50-cent word will do. This comes to a choice of voice in your writing. I think certainly in fantasy we have a lot of big words. In science fiction we have a lot of big words because it's so scientific. Evaluate how you're using them. Evaluate if they're appropriate for your audience. Evaluate if they're appropriate for your character to be using. If all of those things check out, that is fine. And if you're not using them a whole ton, that is fine. But if you can get away with a 50-cent word, that's just even more accessible for your reader. So maybe just try that. Okay. So some might think of emotional development as like a developmental editing thing. I think it's something you need to be focusing on intensely at the developmental stage, and then even again at the line stage, so that you're conveying everything as neatly and as poignantly as possible. So you've already created your emotional framework, you've already nailed it down, you've already seen how it plugs into your character arc. That's great. Now it's the time to dig deeper. Again, use those specific details, engage with the physical senses. Don't be afraid to embrace vulnerability in your characters. Yeah?
So this is something I kind of struggle with because I'm trying not to, when you're trying to have the character have emotion, not have it be slightly or fairly or whatever. But then I feel like my character's bipolar because they're here and then they're here. And then
Right.
Here. So how do you keep them normalized so they're not crazy all over the spectrum?
Right.
But still use strong words?
Okay. Yeah, so 2 answers to that. One, you kind of want to be tracking the tension of your scene and the emotion of your character throughout the scene. And that is not necessarily something that you need to be looking at that is something you look at on your own and might not necessarily end up in the final manuscript for your reader. But it is something that you want to be aware of because it's innately encoded into the tension. And if we're kind of seeing that rise and fall in the character even before they have their big blow up in the scene, that adds tension, that adds characterization, that adds a lot of great things. And then it doesn't necessarily feel as jarring when they're like, I will kill you, those kinds of things. That's one answer to that. I can't remember what the second answer was. Yeah, I think as long as you're just kind of encoding it throughout, especially in reaction to what is happening to that character at that point in the story, we're more willing to be like, well, yeah, they're going through a hard time. Look at all this stuff that happened leading up to when she said that she would kill that dude, we're more willing to be empathetic about it if it doesn't feel like it's sudden. Does that help? Okay. And then with amplifying emotions, concrete details, not like her sadness was like the rain falling outside of the broken window. What does that even mean? She couldn't breathe. She was so sad she couldn't breathe. I think anybody who has felt depression or has felt grief has felt that way. Anxiety, stomach twisting, you're sweating, your heart is racing. Dig into these visceral details, and the reader has likely felt all of these at one point or another in his or her life, so they can really engage with that. It's a very concrete, specific way to get your emotion across without adding paragraphs and paragraphs of fancy how they're feeling kind of contents. Okay, so this is a higher level thing, and we're doing okay on time, I think. Oof, okay. So tone is how your story feels. Oftentimes it's kind of filtered through your point of view character. So when I see tone being conveyed in a manuscript, most often it's being conveyed through a consistent usage of setting So, you know, it's constantly cloudy outside. The moon is constantly filtering through whatever at night. It's raining a lot. There's just like an overall, like, think about every Dementor scene in Harry Potter, right? That is tone. That is setting, informing the tone. And then additionally, you know, we get those ugly, ugly feelings through Harry's perspective. That is his perspective informing the tone. And yeah, and that's how you do that, I guess. And you want to make sure that your first sentence has tone. Like the first scene of your book should have tone. And it's okay if your tone changes, just as your setting changes, just as your character changes. That is fine. It doesn't need to be one consistent tone throughout the entire manuscript. But we just want to see it changing as your character is, and we just want to be kind of plugged into your character and what is happening and where they are while that tone is changing. I think that's it. Oh, and then if you have multiple point of view characters, it is fine and even very appropriate for your tone to be different between them. I mean, if you have like a very like dark comedy kind of character, like the tone for their point of view might be a little more sarcastic, you know, black humor versus like a more authentic character who is having a more like black and white experience. Like, for instance, you know, if we were to get a point of view filtered through Captain America's point of view in any Marvel movie versus like Loki's point of view through any Marvel movie, the tone is going to be different, right? And then if you guys have any like specific questions about any of this, because I feel like we're moving pretty quick, feel free to email me, feel free to come up and ask me after. Okay, so subtext. I love subtext. It's what happens when there's more going on in the story than what we're seeing like at the surface. Subtext is like where all the fan fiction comes from, guys. I love it. So there's two great ways to capitalize on subtext. One is indirectness, and this is one of my very, very favorites. This is when your characters are kind of like avoiding. They're saying one thing, but they mean another. And that like tension is rising because we know that there's stuff that they're not owning to, but they're just gonna let it simmer until it like blows up all over your book, and then it's kind of fun when that happens. Yeah?
What's some suggestions for showing that a person has arcs of that story where a boy is like his father, never around, that's about the board, and that house. And his father basically gets put in coma, and they really have to go get something to save his father, and he basically literally left his mother, and his mother's mother that's the coma.
Right.
So he might die, but how do you show that conflict inside the character? They don't want to do what they're doing, and they're angry and sad. How do you show that?
That is really interesting, and I really like that premise. I would say don't be afraid for the character to really consistently think about all the ways in which his father has failed him. But similarly, like, don't be afraid for that character to, I don't know, be resentful, and like all of those things should be present. And then perhaps in terms of the motivation, maybe we more frequently see him actively thinking, I need to do this for mom, rather than I need to do this for dad. You know, that can kind of show that like maybe his loyalties lie in a different place than where he thinks they should. Also, self-imposed guilt is a great form of like internal tension, and it seems like there's a lot of that with that character. That could be a great addition of like indirectness in subtext. Of course. So incongruence is another great one. So this is where there's more, or rather there's like things that are out of alignment. So for instance, let's say you spend the early half of your book setting up a character that is very type A, very tidy, not a hair out of place, like super prepared. They are that person. And then something happens to them. And then later on in the book, their home is just a disaster. It's a pigsty. They start shirking responsibility, those kinds of things. So without ever actually saying, well, so-and-so was traumatized because of this thing and that they're working through it, we can just see it by the incongruence of how we perceive their character at the beginning versus how they are after that trauma happened to them. So we've talked a lot about voice. I'll move through it quickly. Use the point of view that lends itself to your voice. If you're good at writing first person and you can engage with that character voice, do first person. If you're good at like having a little bit more of a narrative distance, but also like attaching yourself to that character, do third person, that's fine. Just with dialogue, rhythm is great. So you want it to sound natural. You want to listen to the way people speak. And And then word choice and background. Again, everything you do has to be plugged into who your character is. If they're educated, they're going to use different words than if they're not. If they are a happy person, they're going to use different words than if they are an unhappy person. All of these things need to inform your character's voice. We've talked about dialect already. And then like just consistency. Just consistency throughout how you do everything. So if you have a character who starts off really sarcastic and kind of like borderline angry, and then they're sweet later on, something either needs to have happened to them, like big, to like change who they fundamentally are in their character voice, or maybe you need to address some inconsistency issues. Okay, copy editing. Woo! We're doing it, guys. Okay, so I'm going to ask all of you to read your manuscript line by line, because spell check will not save you. Google Docs spell check is actually awful. You have to do it yourself. I do recommend that you try Grammarly, if this is something that you really, really struggle with. I've never used it myself because I'm a copy editor. I do that myself. But I've heard that there is a free version of Grammarly, and you can sign up for it. You can plug your manuscript in.
Also the website Hemingway.
Hemingway?
Hemingway does provide complicated sentences.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah. Is it Hemingway.com?
Yeah, Hemingway app.
Hemingway app.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the lid is the whole manuscript.
Oh, that's amazing. Did you guys all hear that? So Hemingway app is great. Grammarly is also great. And then, this is a huge community of writers here in Utah, and there's a really big community of editors, and there's a lot of overlap in terms of what we do. I'm sure every single one of you has a friend or knows a friend of a friend who is an editor. Feel free to reach out to them, and if you can't pay for a copy editor, see if you can trade work with them if they're a writer. Say, hey, if you will copy edit my manuscript, I will do a beta read on your manuscript. That kind of thing. There are resources available, and you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of money to get that help if that's not your strength. Okay, so punctuation. Not too much and not too little, but just right. I'm going to tell all of you now, from here on out, for the rest of your writing careers, you get 3 exclamation points per manuscript. Yeah, that's all you get. So use it sparingly and use it carefully. Don't just sprinkle it everywhere. You need commas. We want to eat with our fathers. We don't want to eat our fathers, okay? Memes about this abound. And again, if commas are not your strength, look at Grammarly, look at Hemingway app, ask a friend for whom commas are their strength, and, see if they can help you out. Okay. Verb conjugations and tenses. Lay, sink, drag, swim, and shine are the ones that pop out to me the most often. But there's a lot of them. Just be double checking. And if it sounds weird to you, maybe look it up. Don't take these things for granted, because typically if it's an error at some point in your manuscript, it's probably an error at 50,000 other points in your manuscript. Rarely are these errors isolated incidents. And then just be consistent in your tense usage. If you're going to do a past tense, just be there. Just be there in the past tense. If you're going to do present tense, be there in the present tense. Yeah. Okay. Whew. How are you guys doing? Yeah, question. That is a choice. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to that. What I think is most important for flashbacks is that there is a visual cue for your reader. So that might be putting the flashback in italics. That might be using some section breaks. That might be doing a few lines of intro into the flashback. I think it's most important that your reader knows that it's a flashback rather than using different tenses. But that is also a legitimate choice if you want to do that. It just kind of depends. But if that's how you address flashbacks in your book, make sure you use it consistently. And make sure that there's no other venturing into past tense in your book so that the reader doesn't get confused. Okay, are your brains ready to melt? Because my tongue is ready to fall out of my mouth. Okay, final pass. Woo! Okay, so we've done the developmental stuff. We've talked to beta readers. We've thought hard about conventions. We've looked at our lines. We've trimmed, 10,000 words out of our manuscripts. We've allocated our 3 exclamation points that we get in the book. We've done all these things. It's great. It's polished. This is the best version of the book that we can possibly create. Kudos to us. The last step is proofing it, and this is something you can do on your own, and there's a bunch of ways that you can do this. I think it's incredibly helpful to read your book aloud, because it shows, like, if there are lines that you are consistently tripping over as you say them, your reader is probably going to consistently trip over them as they read it. This is really, really especially great for dialogue, reading aloud. You can really tell if your dialogue is like stunted or clunky when you read it aloud, and then that might be, maybe you need to kind of go back and tweak it a little bit. If you don't have time to read your 500-page book aloud to yourself, because that does take time and is exhausting, you can put it into Word, and Word, I guess, will read it to you. That's a thing now. That's so cool. So you can do it audiobook style. Similarly with proofing, you can read things out of order because you also kind of want to be looking once more for any word choices that feel weird, or any typos that have snuck through, or any half of a sentence that you accidentally forgot to delete 4 drafts ago and it's just kind of stuck around ever since. So you can be reading it out of order, and sometimes that'll actually help you catch things. Yeah? Yeah, chapters out of order, paragraphs out of order. You can read it end to start instead of start to end, because you've already done a lot of developmental work and you've already thought hard about a lot of this developmental stuff, so you don't necessarily need to be looking for any more developmental stuff. This is just again, just any weird errors that have snuck through multiple drafts that you just kind of want to look for once more. And so you don't necessarily need to be with the linear story as you're doing that. Read your manuscript from bottom to top, right to left. So you'll see each word on its own. That kind of will help you catch some spelling errors, some grammar errors, some just weird stuff that you're like, I don't even know how that got there. Question? Mm-hmm. Right, and that is a judgment call that you get to make as the author. I would say lean heavily on how you're using your dialogue, on your specific word choices, make sure you're not overusing dialogue tags, but also don't be afraid to use dialogue tags, because again, if we have characters screaming at each other constantly throughout the book, thank you so much, that is just very desensitizing to us and kind of distracting. And 2, your neighbor's point about emotional perspective, again, it's just very drawing to have people screaming at each other all the time. You want to build up to that. I hope that answers your question. You can also print out your book and proofread it that way. We catch things on physical hard copies that we don't catch on electronic screens. Or you can read it on Kindle, which will kind of plug it into a different visual format. That's a great way to catch things. Okay, we're so close. General formatting stuff, 12-point font is great, double-spaced is great, double-check your section breaks, that kind of stuff. 1 space after a period. And if you decide how you're going to use italics early on, whether that's to indicate flashbacks, whether that's to indicate internal dialogue, or to indicate emphasis in spoken words, and then, as you're proofing and reading through it, kind of see whether or not maybe you can tone down some of that. Because we don't want to, because if everything is emphasized, nothing is emphasized, right? We want to use it sparingly. Okay, a quick point about sensitivity readers, because there's a lot of fantasy and science fiction work here. So do we all know what sensitivity readers are? Have we heard of them? Okay, so a sensitivity reader is, for instance, if I was going to write a book with an LGBT character in it, I am not personally LGBT, so I would want, after finishing that draft of the book or whatever, getting it ready for publication, I would want to send it to a sensitivity reader, so somebody who is LGBT, who is qualified to read this book and who has lived that experience that I am trying to represent in that book, and then they can weigh in and tell me, if I'm being problematic, if I'm being accurate, all of these things. Sensitivity readers are not necessarily something you want to be doing after proofing. This is just kind of like a general, like, let's talk about it for a second. But in general, if you are representing an experience that is not your own, or a culture that is not your own, or you're using an invented culture that is not informed by your own culture, you may want to consider using a sensitivity reader to make sure you are not kind of using a lot of stereotypes or problematic representations or anything like that. And this could be its own hour-long thing too. All the men in the room, if you have female characters in your book, please have a female beta reader, at least one, right? Read your book, okay? Vice versa for women. If you have male characters in your book, have a male read your book and see how it weighs in. We don't want to have a lot of like weird male gaze stuff. We don't want to have a lot of weird like toxic masculinity. You know, just there's easy ways to avoid these kinds of pitfalls. Okay, so some final thoughts. Editing is incredibly mentally intensive. Like a typical editor would probably spend anywhere from 20 to 40 hours on your book per editing pass, depending on how long it is and depending how much work it needs. So this is not something, this whole process is not something you're going to want to do in like 3 days. You will kill yourself, and it will also not be very effective. Give yourself time, let your brain rest, let yourself mull over things before you go back for another pass. Time is the best editor, honestly. So when you return to an unfinished piece of writing or a piece that you're still trying to polish, when you have that distance, chances are you'll have the insight that you needed to kind of like make things as best as they possibly can be. And then aim for professional, forget perfectionist, because spoiler alert, your book will never be perfect. But also, congratulations, you've written a book. You're like the top 5% of the world of people who actually follow through on doing this. Make sure you do pat yourself on the back for all of the incredibly hard work that it has taken for you to get there. Okay, I'm Kelsy. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm so sorry for how tired your brains must be.